This is Suzanne Wagner of the C.G. Jung Institute of Los Angeles. In the next hour, you will be viewing a conversation between a noted Jungian analyst of London, Baroness Vera von der Heydt, and the renowned English novelist Richard Adams. Mr. Adams first received world recognition for his novel Watership Down, and subsequently has published several other critically acclaimed novels. Baroness von der Heydt has practiced as a Jungian analyst in London for over 30 years. She recounts briefly here her first meeting with Dr. C.G. Jung of Zurich, who became her analyst and mentor some years later. She has also had a close association with Father Victor White, a noted Catholic priest and author who had a significant relationship with Jung. Another close friend and associate was John Layard, the noted analyst and author who was one of the first people to practice Jungian psychology in England. Over the course of the years, Vera von der Heydt has published articles and lectures and has made many public appearances on radio and television discussing Jung's analytical psychology. A major interest of hers has been the relationship between Jungian psychology and religion. In 1976, Vera von der Heydt published a book entitled Prospects for the Soul, Soundings in Jungian Psychology and Religion. This conversation was filmed in the London apartment of Mr. Adams in October of 1978.
Well, Baroness, you've had now, by any standards, a long life. 80 years, which have covered the whole of this century.
Yes.
How do you feel about it?
I have tried to think about it, and I sometimes wonder whether it is really still me, because I've seen such a lot. I went, after all, through 2 wars, one in Germany, one in Britain, and in between those 2 wars was the whole experience of Hitler, which was a revolution, and not only like a revolution. And everything that one valued once upon a time is so completely different from what is being valued now that sometimes I find myself perplexed about what is happening in the psyches of young people. I think it must be extraordinarily difficult for young people to live now. I feel very strange, and sometimes I can hardly believe that I was brought up in a world which was secure, and where people were rich, and where people didn't pay many taxes, and where everybody seemed to be satisfied and quite happy. And when the First War broke out, it was a great dramatic event. Although I was only 14, nevertheless quite a number of my boyfriends went and were killed. My father was very unhappy because from the first day of the war he knew that it could only end with a disaster for Germany. And this was sometimes difficult because people thought that my father was defeatist, which he wasn't, but he was a realist. Then I married and went to Holland, which was again an extraordinary experience, to go from a people who were revolutionarily divided and coming into a country which had not suffered from the war directly and which was fairly stable.
How old were you when that happened?
18. And I lived with my husband in Holland and in Switzerland up to my 27th year. And then we separated, and I went back to live with my parents till 1933. And then I decided that I might be a danger to my family.
Because of your Jewish blood? Or?
That's right.
Yes.
And so I decided to go to Britain and to London, where I had friends, and I settled in London and was in London for the beginning of the Second World War. Then I went to Oxford, and eventually I found myself working at a clinic in Edinburgh as an analyst. I had my first analysis in Oxford with John Layard, and this had been a tremendous experience for me. He was a Jungian.
But you'd met Dr. Jung before that, had you
Yes,
not?
I had.
Can you tell me something about that?
Well, it was really rather fun. It was just during the time when I was in the middle of my divorce. I was very unhappy and very distressed. And Count Kaiserling, who arranged the summer school, Easter school in Darmstadt, had invited me to come and help with his dinner parties. And he had arranged it in such a way that the speakers of the day would be sitting next to me, which was very lovely and gave me a tremendous sort of feeling of well-being.
This would be about 1928?
27.
27,
27. Yes. And that particular year, Jung was speaking at this school, and he was speaking about man and the earth. I didn't understand what he was saying at all, but I did know that there was a man with a tremendous charisma. When he sat next to me at dinner, I found it quite easy to speak to him, although I had an image that he was really a very old and very wise bird. And
How old was he then?
About 60, I should imagine.
I see.
And the bird that came to my mind was a raven. And it was only very much later that I realized that Wotan had two ravens who told him about the secrets of the universe.
And did your friendship or acquaintance with Jung continue from that time, or
No.
did you lose touch with him?
No. This was the very extraordinary thing, and something which I only recognized how important it was very much later, that Jung, who had a tremendous intuition, and he felt about people, must have known that at that time I was really in great distress.
He sensed this without you telling him?
Yes, I'm sure. But he never said a word. He never said to me, why don't you come to Zurich? Or why don't you come and see me? Because he had such a tremendous respect for the individual soul and for the psyche of any individual, that he felt it had to come from the person themselves, and that he would never even attempt to influence somebody.
And yet it wasn't until 20 years later, and what a 20 years too, an enormous gap of time, recovering the Second World War and heaven knows what, that you later encountered Jung in his capacity as an analyst in Zurich.
Yes, that is true. I went to Edinburgh to work at a clinic there, and I realized that I needed much more help, and I went, encouraged by Father Victor Heydt, the Dominican friend of Jung's, to go to Ascona to one of the Eranos meetings. Father Victor was speaking there. And I told Father Victor that I would like to meet Jung, and he told me how to proceed in order to be in his way and stop him, and so to speak, make him stop, which I did. And Jung at that time was very interested in everybody and anything who were Catholics. And when I reminded him of our dinner at Darmstadt 20 years ago, he thought that that really was a reason to talk to me. And he gave me an date to see him. And I told him about my teaching young prospective youth leaders. And he asked me what they had been doing, and I told him that they had been painting a hall, the 4 functions. That intrigued him. And then he said, well, what else did you tell them? And I told him that I suggested they should think of every day as if it was their last. Well, he seemed to get very silent, and then after a while said, don't you think that this is rather a grim philosophy? Well, I didn't think so. But he then said, well, if you can get a sabbatical, come and see me in Zurich, and I would be willing to see you regularly. I remember very well the first time I sat in Jung's consulting room, and the tremendous thing happened that Jung spoke to me in German, because he remembered me 20 years ago, and he knew who I was, and he knew my background. And I hadn't spoken German for a long time because I had been so distressed about what had been happening in Germany. And when Jung spoke in German, of course it never occurred to me to say, would you mind speaking English? I just spoke in German, told him my dreams, my experiences in German. And 2 things happened. First of all, I realized how much I had repressed and how important it was that Jung knew the associations and the various amplifications from the content of my unconscious material. But there was also something else which helped me later in my own work, and that was to recognize and realize how important it is to analyze somebody in their own language. And this, I think, is one of the terribly important things which Jung activated in me and which I'm absolutely certain Jung knew about. Because however important the collective unconscious may be, you can only cope and deal with unconscious material if you know about the tremendous role the ego and consciousness play. And that, to some extent anyway, is language.
Yes, that's very interesting indeed. And tell me, did you meet Mrs. Jung, Madame Jung?
Yes, I did. I saw Emma quite frequently. She was a woman I respected enormously. She was very beautiful, and she was a great lady. But quite apart from those qualities, she had a quality of warmth and of friendliness, which I appreciated very much. I had tea with her, or coffee, or lunch, or something, and she was always tremendously friendly and very easy. And at that time, actually, quite a number of people analyzed both with Emma Jung and with Tony Wolff, which sounds strange, but they did it, and it seems that it was very helpful, because Emma was more on the line of collective unconscious, whereas Tony, it seems, was very much more interested, so to speak, in the awareness of ego. Emma has the great quality of having recognized that Jung idea of the animus being the equivalent of the anima was a mistake. The animus is not the equivalent in woman of the anima in man, because anima is always feminine. Anima is the soul. And whether the soul is in man or in woman, it would always be feminine. The animus is the spirit of woman. And that, I think, is tremendously important, because it is the spirit of woman which, so to speak, pushes her into activity and to action, but also, of course, into hostility and being animacy, being possessed by the animals, and argumentative and not always terribly pleasant. Very often one hears people talk about the anima being the feminine side of man. And of course he can be possessed by the anima and be moody and difficult and behaving like the moon. But basically, Jung's idea was that they were functions, and that therefore, if I have a function, it means that I'm supposed to be using it. So the man is supposed to be using his feminine aspect, his feminine side, apart from having a soul, whereas the woman is supposed to be using her masculine side, which one usually thinks of as being thinking and action and all that, and not only projecting it into the external man or the external woman, as men so often do, in external reality.
Yes, now that's very illuminating. You say that you spoke to Jung about your dreams. This is something I'd like to pursue a little, the whole idea of dreams. I learned very much from you of the great importance and relevance of dreams.
I find it awfully difficult to work without dreams as well, although obviously there are people who do not dream, and then you have to work with them without dreams. For instance, I myself dreamt comparatively very little. I had times for a week or a fortnight or something like that when I dreamt every night, and then for the next 3 months I might not have any dream at all. I worked very much more, actually, with, you might almost say, visionary experiences. But I think that one of the difficulties about dreams which were brought up by some of the Jungian analysts is that, first of all, they thought that dreams contained too much transference material. That is to say, that the dreams were dreamt to some extent influenced by the experiences somebody had in their analysis of their analyst, and they preferred to work, as it were, straight with the transference. Other people, again Jungians, thought that there was a danger for the analyst to analyze more the collective aspect, the archetypal aspect of a dream, and forget too much about the ego aspect. And I think that that is true. I think that's happened quite a lot, that people started to talk about the beautiful dreams they had had with all the possible archetypes in it, and they would then talk about this, that, or the next thing, and forgot about the importance of assimilating this particular material to the ego and live it.
I myself You always say I'm a great moralist. I probably am. I had a rather strict upbringing by some people's standards. I'm never happy with a dream until I've found something unwelcome in it, something that I would rather not know. A kind of, when I've had a dose of nasty medicine, as it were, I feel the better for the dream.
Yes, well, you know, sometimes people tell me I've had a bad dream or I had a good dream or something. And I have always felt the idea of having a bad dream rather curious, because to me, dreams show something of the inner landscape. And if I see something in the inner landscape, whether it is my own or somebody else's, which I don't particularly much like, but nevertheless, it then comes into consciousness. Personally, I don't speak about it as nasty medicine, but I want to go down on my knees and say, hallelujah, hallelujah. So it means that I have learned something.
So often, though, the dream, if you pursue it, Jung said, if you carry a dream about with you long enough and think about it at bus stops and on subways and things, something nearly always comes of it. I found that what generally comes of it, sometimes weeks later, you remember an association with something of which you may not necessarily be ashamed, but something that embarrasses you, or something that you realize shows an inadequacy in your character. And this, to me, is where the profit of the dream comes.
Yes, I think that that is quite true. We are ashamed of ourselves. We are ashamed that we had this or that association or wish or hope or whatever. That is perfectly true. But this would really come onto the line of our dark side or of our shadow side. That is to say, a side which we do not like or which we are ashamed of because of our upbringing, because of conditionings, because of collective ideas which are running around during that time. But you see, again, it is interesting to look at what it is that makes you ashamed or that makes you feel ashamed, because from my point of view anyway, it shows one that one is a human being. And I think that, again, one of the tremendous things which Jung did was to always emphasize the aspect of man's totality. And our totality is not complete unless we take our human failings into it. It doesn't mean that I necessarily have always to live my human failings. I obviously may have to take responsibility for them. But they are not only part of me, but they are part of every human being. That is to say, it is part of man. And that is why I think it is terribly important to recognize where our shame lies and whether it is a conditioned shame, whether it is a misunderstood precept, whether we really feel ashamed or whatever it is.
Would you not say that the moral courage to get stuck into people's problems and bring them face to face with what they don't want to know is a very important part of an analyst's work?
Yes, I think so. I very definitely think so. And I believe that here is one of the points where some of the people who belong to other creeds of psychology reproach Jungians, that they, particularly I think the older type of analyst, Now, I know that I'm not particularly young myself, but nevertheless I have been around and I have profited also from the thoughts of others. And that, I think, is the great mistake which some of the then Jungians made, that they were too kind, that they were too interested, exactly as I said before, in the collective and in
This
archetypes.
is indeed a very common fallacy, isn't it? But I remember you saying to me once, when we were working together, and something was distressing me rather, and I was telling you that I often felt very tired. And I always remember what you said. You said, having an analysis is no joke, and it is necessary to roll a bit with the punch and to realize that you are going to be tired, and there are going to be times when you do feel thoroughly knocked up by this experience.
Yes. Jung once said to me, you know, you have to be very careful because you will have to shake somebody occasionally. He was against ECT, electric shock treatment, and he told me that he was against it because he said, if anybody gives any kind of shock during an analysis, I am going to give it, but not a machine. And he told me about some woman who had been very forceful and very animacy and who had tried, I think, to box with Jung. But Jung was the wrong man to sort of
very large man.
He was a big man. And Jung said, look, if you are trying those kind of tricks, don't be afraid of me, but I am going to hit back. And he said to me, that is what you will have to learn to do.
Well, you'd be rather better equipped to box with Jung, I would have thought.
Well, no. But what I'm trying to get at is that I think there is the difficulty how to get unpleasant things across. Well, I know that there are quite a number of people who will really be very unpleasant and really very disagreeable. But I have found by far the best is if one has the feeling that there is something not quite right, to ask. I don't tell people, I ask them.
Have you ever faced actual physical danger in the course of your work?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
You coped with it all right, did you?
You know, this is a very curious thing. I had a young man who was schizophrenic, and he suddenly became very angry, and I was expecting a violence from him. And I had thought that I might be afraid when this kind of thing were to happen. And I suddenly found myself getting absolutely cold and absolutely, you know, not afraid at all. And I was able to say to this young man, would you mind putting this statue or whatever he had in his hand, would you mind putting it down? It might get broken. And I think the man was so surprised that he just did it like a lamb, and that was it. But I never have otherwise been assaulted, although there were both ladies and gentlemen who felt that I might be a nice sexual object. But a woman who wanted me to comply with her wishes, when I said I didn't think that it was the right way of conducting our work, because I felt, in any case, that whatever one person wanted, it had to be reciprocated by the other. It was too important. And I was sorry, but I did not reciprocate her feelings. She told me, what are you saying? Surely you are nothing but an archetype. And I said, I am an archetype, but not nothing but.
Baroness, during the last 20 or 30 years, as we all know, a kind of cult has grown up around Jung, almost a kind of hagiography, you know, Saint Jung, as it were, and everybody talks about Jung said this and Jung said that, and the time when I met Jung. I wonder what he himself would have thought about this. No human being is completely infallible, but people sometimes talk as though Jung were.
I don't think that he would have thought very much of that. In any case, he always thought that he might have started off whatever it was, but that obviously after him people would come who would know more and who would make things more usable or something of that kind. In any case, I think that he very definitely had a shadow side, which some people saw very clearly, some people experienced it very definitely. And although I did not myself get a great deal of it, nevertheless I did get a whiff. For instance, I was once going to see him. At the time I was no longer in Zurich, I came from Scotland. And he was very interested in the UFOs, in the flying objects. And he was writing about it. And when I was in his study, he had a picture standing there. He told me that he had this picture for some time, and it was in his attic, and he had brought it down, and it had been painted by a friend of his. And he asked me to look at it, which I did. And he said, "What do you see?" Well, it was a dark picture, and I didn't see very much. However, I said, well, I saw a house or a cat or something, see? And he was simply livid with me, because I had not seen what he wanted me to see, namely sort of some kind of a rounded sun or something. And he thought that that was actually something like a UFO, like one of those flying objects. And this, he had made an experiment, and he wanted me, as it were, obviously, sort of to go along with him, and was terribly disappointed about my idiocy. And so I did realize he didn't suffer fools very gladly, and he really was quite cross. So this quite obviously was a shadow side.
Well, you were quite justified on that occasion.
Oh, yeah, but whether I was justified or not, I was petrified, because I knew that he wanted me to see something and I couldn't see it. And so that was it. But also, I think that he could be quite difficult in relationships, and he says it himself. He says that as soon as, or when somebody no longer was able to give him whatever it was he wanted, that he got very easily tired or bored people. Once it was quite interesting. It was very soon after the war. There was supposed to be the first International Psychological Congress in London. And I was in Zurich at the time, and at the time at the club, the Jung Club in Zurich, which met once a fortnight, and Jung always came at that time, people were supposed to be talking about guilt from various points of view, and the whole Congress was supposed to be about guilt. And that particular evening, there was a priest from Zurich who spoke about guilt in the Roman Catholic Church and confession and all this kind of thing. And everybody thought that he was doing very well, and he had spoken very well, and was very interesting. And Jung also, during the talk, had nodded and had made, apparently, movements to say that he was quite happy. And then Jung opened the discussion, and to absolutely everybody's horror, he began sort of to tear this poor man to absolute pieces. And nobody understood what had got into him. And the next morning I rang up Barbara Hannah, because Barbara was his chauffeur, so to speak. And I said, Barbara, what did Jung say? What happened? And she said that he had told her that his Protestant ancestors had suddenly reared their ugly heads.
No, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who analysed Jung, as it were?
Freud.
I see.
I'm not sure, but I have heard some people who knew Jung well say that they thought he sometimes lacked what we might call moral courage occasionally, and that he could have told Freud earlier that he was not in sympathy with his ideas. And this accusation has also been made against him in the way he not treated so much Toni Wolff, but the way he allowed her memory, as it were, to disappear from the Institute and from the club. And it was only with a certain amount of I don't know whether one called it manipulation or what, that Tony's picture was hung up again at in the one of the rooms of the Institute. The family of Jung, of course, was not keen for her memory to be kept green.
And Mrs. Jung jealous of her?
It's a very difficult question. I'm certain she was. I think that probably Toni Wolff might have wanted to marry Jung. I don't know.
They were lovers, I take it.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
And Toni had a very great influence intellectually on Jung. It was she who introduced him to all the Eastern spirituality, Eastern philosophy, and so on. She's supposed to have had quite an influence on him, and I'm sure that that is true because she was a very wonderful woman, really. And Emma, of course, had the children, and she was not intellectual in the same sense as Toni was. And there is this very moving thing that Jung was fascinated by the Grail and by the stories about the Grail, but he never touched anything to do with it or any of the myths connected with the Grail, because it was Emma who was working and researching on it, and so he wouldn't do it.
Emma knew of their relationship, but she didn't wish to divorce Jung.
Oh, good gracious, no. It would never have entered her head.
No, I see.
I mean, that wouldn't have been done. I mean,
That's rather unusual.
No, I don't think so. Not at that time. I mean, I don't even think nowadays. I mean, she had 4 children, and I don't think that Jung would have wanted a divorce at all.
Well, perhaps this isn't really relevant, but not many women will countenance open infidelity.
Please forgive me. I am not so sure if that is not a kind of British, maybe even English prejudice, conditioning, or something. I think that...
I think it's an American one, too.
Is it?
Well, never mind. Perhaps this is irrelevant.
Yes. I think that it would never have occurred to Emma to have a divorce.
Yes, I see. Well, let us go on to what may be a rather more profitable subject to talk about, Jung's relationship to women in general.
But he loved women.
Don't we all?
No. No, I would contest that.
Well, lots of us.
No, he was very positive about women's capacities, particularly as analyst. He had the highest respect, incidentally, both for Emma and obviously also for Toni, but he also had a tremendous respect for Maru's Franz and for all the women who were around him. And it is very interesting that there are a great many women who who were around him originally. When I was in Zurich, the women who were working around him were all very outstanding personalities, whether it was Tony Wolff or, of course, his wife, but then Linda Fiertz, Barbara Hanna, Marlus Franz, Angela Jaffe. They were all tremendously outstanding in their particular kind of field.
And what do you think he would have thought of the women's liberation movement?
I think he would have laughed. I think
Would
he
he
would
have felt that it
laughed.
was essentially an unfeminine role?
Yes, I think probably he would. I think he probably would. And I think he would have seen it as a misunderstanding and as a misconception.
Kind of aping of the role of men, proceeding in an unfeminine way.
That certainly. You see, I think that since he had such a very high respect for women and such very high respect for feminine qualities, I think that he would have had the idea of unisex and everything kind of one thing, in that sense, as simply a mistake, that women did not recognize their tremendous importance. And you see, one of his real ideas was the idea of rebirth. And you can only be reborn through a womb. Once upon a time, Freud spoke about penis envy. I do not believe necessarily that women now have penis envy, but what they do have is a hate of their wombs. And that, again, is something which has been shown in the first kibbutzim, where the women were very unhappy about the idea of giving birth. And I think that now many women are unhappy and angry that whatever they say about liberation, they will never be liberated from having their babies, and no man will ever have a womb and have a baby. And I think that here Jung would have seen this as the height of the misunderstanding, that a woman, I don't say women, but woman at the moment, has lost the feeling for the importance of the womb and therefore for the importance of rebirth and of the possibility and potentiality of being reborn.
You said to me once, I've never forgotten it, that you thought that the relations between men and women today were extremely difficult for a number of reasons, possibly more difficult than they had ever been, and that this was one of the great problems of the time.
Yes, I think that is true. And I think that Jung's attitude to this also was the difficulty being that women were becoming more conscious. If the man was used to being the head of the house and the household, etc., and the woman just simply did what the man wanted, and now the man has to listen to what the woman has to say, it would make a relationship more conscious and therefore more difficult.
Yes. You were present, I believe, at Jung's funeral, and the whole business of his death was something that had a great effect upon you.
Yes, I was used to going to see Jung when I had returned to Britain, more or less once a year, sometimes perhaps even twice, and he always saw me. And I was obviously always very happy if I could be sitting with him, even only just for half an hour. And it was a great loss. I would almost like to say a cosmic loss when he died, although obviously he was very old and he had been very ill, and therefore one expected this death to happen. Actually, when he had died, quite a number of people from the SAP, that is to say the Society of Analytical Psychology, we went over to the funeral, which was a very splendid and a very wonderful affair. But the interesting thing was that in this church where the memorial service was held, there was not the coffin, because whilst the memorial service went on, Jung was being buried, and the only people who were present at his burial were his family and Dr. Bennett, who had been a friend of the family. Actually, as far as I can say, the only real friend of the whole family, who was a psychiatrist and analyst. Everybody else was in the church, and then about half a dozen people spoke about him. And one of the talks which I remember best was by a Protestant theologian called Dr. Scheer, and he spoke of Jung as having been a great prophet who had possibly misunderstood certain theological questions, but who had revivified Christianity and who he considered to have been one of the great prophets. And I thought that this was very, very impressive. The church, of course, was absolutely full. And then afterwards there was a reception at Jung's house, which was obviously melancholy, with a lot of big spread and many people. And then one went home.
I remember Jung was once asked about the existence of God, and he replied, "I don't think I know."
I don't believe I know. And it was his interview with John Freeman, face to face, where he said it. I think that what Jung meant was that he was very conscious of the center of his being, which he called the self. And he would talk about the God image living, being alive in this center of our whole being. He always said he did not wish to discuss the existence of God because this was a metaphysical question which he was not prepared to go into. But from the psychological point of view, he knew that the God image was within oneself. The God image changes. God does not change.
From person to person or from time to time?
Oh, yes.
Both?
Yes, of course. Because my God image, surely, if I am 5 years old, would be slightly different, I hope, from when I am 79.
But nonetheless valid, you say?
Oh, yes, of course. And Jung knew that. But also there is another thing, and this obviously is a paradox. And for people who don't like paradoxes or who are frightened by paradoxes, it's a very difficult thing to take in, because we always have to remember that on Jung's house in Küsnacht there is a legend, and it says vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit. Called or not called, God is always there. For Jung, religion was an attitude. For Jung, religion was an attitude to life and had absolutely nothing whatever to do with any kind of creed. He was actually ambivalent about creeds because on the one hand he said that a creed would stop you from having an experience, and since he believed that religion was not only an attitude but had to do with experience, personal experience, if you block it by a creed, obviously you can't have an experience. But at the same time, he also thought that a creed might be a tremendously important framework for someone whose ego was too weak to stand the horror, the void of complete loneliness or complete aloneness. But obviously he also thought that there are some people to whom creed and faith coincide. And then, of course, that is all right.
We were speaking of Jung's relationship with Tony Wolff, and this obviously meant a great deal to him. Would you say that Jung had what could broadly be called an anima problem in his relations with women?
No, I don't think that that would be quite right. I think that Tony helped him enormously at a time when he had broken with Freud and was in very great distress of mind, on the one hand, because of his killing the father, you might almost say, and being ostracized himself by so many of his colleagues who thought that he had betrayed Freud. And he then had this time where he went into his own unconscious and into his collective, and Tony helped him enormously at that time. So that was something she could do, which his wife obviously couldn't. But I think that he always remained very grateful to Tony for this help, and also for her supporting him in his later years. I believe that there must have been tension between Emma and Tony, and I think that people were not always terribly happy, on the one hand, about this relationship. On the other hand, it is also true that nobody in Jung's circle actually ever would have mentioned Tony in any kind of disparaging way.
Do you think Jung had close relationships, well, the relationship of a lover with other women?
No, I do not believe that.
No.
No, I do not think so.
Would this be from principle or from inclination?
I have no idea.
No idea at all, no. But there is a general idea, isn't there, that people, that men should be monogamous and completely faithful throughout their lives. In point of fact, we all know that very few men are. What would Jung's attitude be on this question? Can you say?
No, I don't think I could, except saying that these are problems which have to be solved, which have to be faced, which have to be lived through, and have to be worked out with a wife or with a husband. And I don't think that this would have shaken his belief in mankind or in womankind if he heard that anybody had love affairs.
So he took a broad and charitable view of this matter, really, in the same way as he did of religion.
He would take a realistic point of view. He would say, this is man, and this is real, and this is. But the idea of being charitable, I don't think would ever have occurred to him. I'm sorry, you look shocked.
Well, go on.
Well, there is nothing really terribly much more to be said about it, I think. He took this for real in the same way as he took life seriously, and as he would take, or as he took, death seriously. From his point of view, death was something terrible and grievous from a personal point of view. He said, none of us really know what happens after death, And if one reads letters he wrote to bereaved people, one becomes very conscious of the fact that he had tremendous feeling and knew about the pain of separation. After all, both Tony Wolff and Emma died before him, and he grieved. And I think he knew about grieving and separation and what death was about. And at the same time, I think that he believed in some kind of life which is indescribable and which he always connected with the collective unconscious as that goes on and changes and it goes on, that in some curious kind of way the individual human being would also continue in some way which we cannot describe in any intellectual way.
I remember once we were speaking of aging and death, and you said to me, in connection with aging anyway, you said, it is a part and one can only play it gracefully, which I found as helpful as so many of the things that you said to me over the years. It is a part and one can only play it gracefully. But do you also see death not only as a kind of heroic retreat in the face of odds, do you look forward to it in some way as a kind of fulfillment or winding up of one's affairs?
I don't mean to say that I am not frightened, and I think that this is a measure of a lack of faith, because one is always worried about people one loves, what is going to happen to them. That is one side. On the other side, I think I would be very happy to see the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Thank you.
I think that I had a very strong idea about Jung as a total being. I had read Modern Man, Search of the Soul, which influenced me very much indeed. And he was the first man, including John Layard actually, to whom I felt I could not only say everything that went through my mind, but that he opened something in me which had always been closed and which I think had even been shut up even more since I had left Germany and had left it with such horror and such distress, so that I could and would hardly speak German. But Jung spoke German to me, and it was only then that I realized how much I had repressed. And it was he who gave me the key to really get in touch with what I call my soul. My spirit had always remained alive, but my soul hadn't.